The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty road as Sarah Martinez clutched her youngest daughter's hand. Little Maria, barely 4 years old, had stopped asking for breakfast 3 days ago. The silence from the child who once chattered endlessly about butterflies and flowers now cut through Sarah's heart like a blade. Behind them, her two older children walked with the resigned shuffle of those who had learned too young that life wasn't fair. 10-year-old carried their meager belongings in a torn canvas bag, while 8-year-old held baby Carlos against her thin chest. The infant's cries had grown weaker each day, and Sarah tried not to think about what that might mean. They had been walking since dawn, leaving behind the small apartment they could no longer afford. Sarah's husband had been gone for 2 months now, not by choice, but taken by immigration officers during a routine raid at the construction site where he worked. The lawyer they couldn't afford had told her it might be years before she saw him again, if ever. The eviction notice had been the final blow. 3 weeks of searching for work had yielded nothing but sympathetic looks and closed doors. Her broken English and lack of documentation made her invisible to most employers, despite her willingness to work any job, no matter how difficult or dangerous. "Mama, my tummy hurts," whispered, shifting baby Carlos to her other arm. The girl tried to be brave, but Sarah could see the exhaustion in her daughter's dark eyes. "I know," Sarah replied softly, scanning the horizon for any sign of hope. "We're going to find help soon." But even as she said the words, doubt gnawed at her. They had been walking for hours along this rural highway outside of Texas, with no clear destination except away from the city that had failed them. Her sister lived somewhere in the next county, but Sarah wasn't even sure she still lived at the same address from 5 years ago. The Texas heat was already becoming oppressive despite the early hour. Sarah could feel sweat trickling down her back, and she worried about the children becoming dehydrated. They had shared the last of their water bottle an hour ago, and her throat felt like sandpaper. As they crested a small hill, Sarah's heart sank. Ahead stretched more empty road, bordered by endless fields and barbed wire fences. No houses, no stores, no people, just the vast emptiness of rural Texas that could swallow a family whole. "Mama, look," said suddenly, pointing toward a massive gate set between two stone pillars. Beyond it, a long driveway led to what looked like a sprawling ranch house in the distance. Sarah hesitated. The property was clearly expensive, with manicured grounds and several outbuildings that spoke of wealth she couldn't fathom. A metal sign attached to the gate read, "Lazy J Ranch Private Property." Below it, in smaller letters, "No trespassing." But desperation had a way of making decisions easier. Her children were starving, and pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. "Stay here," she told the older children, handing Maria to. "I'm going to ask for help." "Mama, no," protested, fear creeping into her voice. "What if they call the police?" Sarah's stomach clenched at the thought. If the authorities got involved, they might separate the family, put the children in foster care. But the alternative was watching her bobbies waste away from hunger. "I have to try," she said firmly, though her hands trembled as she approached the gate. She expected it to be locked, but to her surprise, it swung open easily under her touch. A sensor somewhere must have detected her approach because she heard a soft beep, but no alarm sounded. Taking a deep breath, she started up the long driveway, each step feeling like a betrayal of every instinct that told her to run. The ranch house was even more impressive up close, a sprawling adobe structure with a red tile roof and wraparound porch. Several expensive-looking trucks were parked nearby, and she could hear the distant sound of cattle and horses. This was clearly a working ranch, but one that generated serious money. Before she could lose her nerve, Sarah climbed the front steps and knocked on the heavy wooden door. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she waited, rehearsing the words she would say. How do you tell a stranger that your children are starving? How do you ask for help without sounding like you're begging? The door opened, and Sarah found herself face to face with a man who looked to be in his 50s. He was tall and lean, with graying hair and weathered skin that spoke of years spent outdoors. His clothes were expensive but practical pressed jeans, a crisp white shirt, and boots that probably cost more than Sarah had made in a month when she was working. But it was his eyes that surprised her. Instead of the suspicion or irritation she expected, she saw something else entirely. Concern, and behind that, a sadness that seemed to mirror her own. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his voice carrying a slight Texas drawl, "you look like you could use some help." Sarah's words came out in a rush, a mixture of Spanish and broken English as her carefully rehearsed speech crumbled under the weight of desperation. "Please, sir, I'm sorry to bother you, but my children. We haven't eaten. We haven't tasted food in nearly a week." Her voice dropped to a whisper with the admission, shame coloring her cheeks red despite the dire circumstances. The man's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. He stepped back slightly and gestured for her to come inside, but Sarah shook her head quickly. "My children," she explained, pointing back toward the gate. "They're waiting by the road." Without hesitation, the man stepped past her onto the porch, squinting in the direction she indicated. Even from this distance, the small figures were visible against the stark landscape. Sarah watched his face carefully, trying to read his intentions. She had learned to be wary of strangers, especially wealthy ones who might see her family as a problem to be solved by calling the authorities. "How many children?" he asked quietly. "4," Sarah replied. "The baby, he's only 6 months old, the others." She trailed off, unable to voice how thin they had become, how their clothes hung loose on their shrinking frames. The man, she still didn't know his name, walked to the edge of the porch and called out in a voice that carried easily across the distance. "It's all right. Bring them up here." Sarah felt a surge of relief mixed with terror. This was either the answer to her prayers or the beginning of a nightmare she couldn't control. As her children made their slow way up the driveway, the man introduced himself. "I'm James," he said simply. "This is my ranch. What's your name?" "Sarah Martinez," she replied, then added quickly, "We're not criminals, mister. We lost everything when my husband—" She couldn't finish the sentence. James nodded as if he understood without needing details. "When's the last time any of you had a proper meal?" The question was simple, but it nearly broke her. "Tuesday," she whispered. "I found some bread behind a bakery in town. We shared it." That had been 6 days ago. When the children reached the porch, Sarah saw James's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Was carrying both Maria and the canvas bag now, his thin arms straining with the effort. Still held baby Carlos, and Sarah could see that the infant was barely conscious, his little head lolling against his sister's shoulder. "Bring the baby here," James said gently, extending his arms. The girl looked to her mother for permission before carefully transferring Carlos to this stranger's arms. James examined the baby with the practiced eye of someone familiar with animals and perhaps human frailty. His expression grew grave as he noted the infant's sunken cheeks and listless state. "We need to get some fluids into this little one right away," he said urgently. "And all of you need food, but we have to be careful. Your stomachs aren't ready for regular meals yet." He ushered them all inside, through a spacious living room decorated with Native American art and family photographs, toward what was clearly the heart of the home, a large, warm kitchen that smelled of coffee and fresh bread. Sarah's knees nearly buckled at the scent. Beside her, she heard make a small sound of longing, and Maria pressed closer to her leg. "Sit," James instructed, pulling out chairs around a massive wooden table. "All of you." As they settled into the chairs, real chairs, not milk crates or the floor, James moved with surprising efficiency around the kitchen. He filled a pot with water and set it on the stove, then opened a cabinet and several items. "I'm going to make some rice water," he explained as he worked. "It's gentle on empty stomachs and it'll help get some nutrition into you without making you sick." He paused, looking directly at Sarah. "I learned about it when I was overseas, Army." That explained the confident way he assessed situations, the quick decision-making. Sarah felt some of her tension ease. Military men, in her experience, were direct but usually fair. While the water heated, James opened his refrigerator and a gallon of milk. "This is for the baby," he said, warming some in a small pot. "He needs immediate attention." "I've been trying to nurse him," Sarah said quietly, "but I haven't been eating enough to—" She trailed off, embarrassed. "No judgment here," James said firmly. "You've been keeping your family alive under impossible circumstances. That takes strength most people don't have." As he prepared the makeshift formula, James kept up a steady stream of gentle conversation with the children. He asked about school, complimented on how well she was caring for her baby brother, and told Maria that he had horses she might like to see later if she felt up to it. The children responded cautiously at first, but something about James's calm presence seemed to put them at ease. When he handed a cup of rice water, the boy looked to his mother before accepting it. Sip it slowly, James instructed. I know you want to drink it all at once, but your stomach needs time to remember how to handle food. Sarah watched her children follow his instructions with the discipline of those who had learned that survival sometimes meant doing things that didn't make immediate sense. They sipped slowly, and gradually, she saw some color return to their faces. As James fed baby Carlos with an improvised bottle, he spoke quietly to Sarah. There's a guest house on the property. It's small, but it's clean and private. You and your children can stay there while we figure out next steps. Sarah's instinct was to refuse. She had learned that accepting help usually came with strings attached, and she couldn't afford to put her children at risk. But looking around the warm kitchen, seeing her bobbies finally getting the nutrition they desperately needed, she realized she didn't have the luxury of pride anymore. What do you want in return? She asked directly. James met her gaze steadily. Nothing you're not willing to give, he said quietly. But we can talk about that later. Right now, let's focus on getting your family healthy again. The guest house was a small miracle. 2 bedrooms, a tiny kitchen, and a bathroom with running water that felt like luxury after weeks of uncertainty. Sarah stood in the doorway, afraid to step inside, afraid this kindness might evaporate if she moved too quickly. The linens are fresh, James said, setting down a basket of groceries on the small counter. There's a washer and dryer in the utility closet. The main house is just a short walk if you need anything, but you won't be disturbed here. Her children had already scattered to explore their temporary haven. Maria was running her small hands along the sofa cushions with wonder, while tested the light switches with the fascination of someone who hadn't had reliable electricity in weeks. Sat in a rocking chair by the window, still holding Carlos, who was sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. Why, Sarah asked suddenly, why are you helping us? James was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window toward the main ranch. I lost my daughter 3 years ago, he said finally. Car accident. She was 22, just graduated from college, full of plans. His voice was steady, but Sarah could see the pain in the set of his shoulders. She used to volunteer at shelters, always bringing home strays, animals, people who needed help. Used to drive my wife crazy. Your wife? Sarah asked softly. She left after Emma died. Couldn't stand being here anymore, seeing reminders everywhere. James turned back to her with a sad smile. Emma would have been furious with me if I'd let a family with children go hungry when I had the means to help. So in a way, I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for her. Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. I'm sorry for your loss. And I'm sorry for yours, he replied, understanding somehow that her grief ran deeper than just recent poverty. Over the next few days, Sarah began to understand the scope of James's wealth and generosity. The Lazy J Ranch sprawled across several thousand acres, running cattle and horses with an efficiency that spoke of generations of experience. James had inherited it from his father, but had expanded it significantly through what Sarah gathered were very smart investments and business decisions. He wasn't just wealthy. He was rich in the way that money could never touch, with knowledge about land management, animal husbandry, and the kind of practical wisdom that came from working with your hands despite having enough money to hire others to do it. But wealth hadn't protected him from loss, and Sarah began to see that his generosity came from a place of understanding what really mattered. On the 3rd morning, as she watched her children playing in the yard outside the guest house, actually playing, not just sitting listlessly, Sarah made a decision. She walked to the main house and found James in his office, a spacious room lined with books about ranching, veterinary science, and what looked like business texts. I want to work, she announced without preamble. James looked up from the papers he was reviewing. Sarah, you don't need to. Yes, I do, she interrupted, then caught herself. I mean, please, I need to contribute. I can't just take from you. What kind of work did you do before? He asked, setting down his pen. Sarah felt her cheeks burn. Cleaning, restaurants, offices, some houses. I'm good at it, fast and thorough. I know you probably have people who... I don't actually, James said thoughtfully. I've been meaning to hire someone to help maintain the main house. My housekeeper retired last year, and I've been making do with a service that comes once a week. It's not enough. Sarah's heart leaped, but she forced herself to stay calm. I would work hard, very hard, and I learn quickly if there are things I don't know how to do. What about the children? Is responsible. He can watch the others while I work, and when Carlos gets older. She trailed off, realizing she was making plans as if this arrangement might be permanent, which was presumptuous. James seemed to read her thoughts. "We can start with a trial period," he suggested. "See how it works for everyone, but I want to be clear about something, Sarah. This isn't charity disguised as employment. I genuinely need help, and if you're willing to do the work, you'll earn every penny I pay you." "How much?" she asked, then immediately regretted the question. She should be grateful for any amount. James named a figure that made Sarah's eyes widen. It wasn't just fair, it was generous, more than she'd ever made cleaning houses in the city. "That includes living in the guest house," he added, "and there's health insurance if you stay on for 6 months." Health insurance. Sarah hadn't dared to dream about such things. Carlos needed regular checkups, and all the children were overdue for basic medical care she simply couldn't afford. "When can I start?" she asked. "Tomorrow if you'd like, but Sarah," James's voice grew serious, "I need to ask about your immigration status." Sarah's blood turned to ice. This was it then, the moment when kindness would turn into a problem that could destroy her family. "I understand if you need to think about it," James continued when she didn't respond. "But I want you to know that whatever your situation, it doesn't change my offer. I just need to know so I can handle the paperwork correctly." Sarah stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "You would hire me even if—" "Even if," he confirmed. "I know a good immigration lawyer if you need one, someone who actually cares about keeping families together." For the first time in months, Sarah felt something she had almost forgotten existed. Hope. Not the desperate hope born of desperation, but real hope, grounded in the kindness of a stranger who had become something more. "My husband," she said quietly, "he was taken during a raid. I don't know when I'll see him again." James nodded. "We'll figure it out," he said simply. "All of it." That evening, as Sarah tucked her children into real beds with clean sheets and full stomachs, Maria looked up at her with eyes that were finally bright again. "Mama, are we safe now?" Sarah smoothed her daughter's hair and kissed her forehead. "Yes," she whispered, "we're safe." For the first time in longer than she could remember, she actually believed it. 3 months later, Sarah barely recognized the woman she had been when she first walked up James's driveway. Her hands, once soft from desperation-induced idleness, were now strong and capable. She had learned to operate the industrial washing machine, to polish the massive wooden furniture until it gleamed, and to prepare meals that filled the kitchen with warmth and the sense of her grandmother's recipes. The transformation in her children was even more remarkable. Had started at the local school, where his quick mind and eagerness to learn had impressed his teachers. Had blossomed into a confident 8-year-old who helped care for Carlos with the skill of someone twice her age. Maria chatted constantly again, often following James around the ranch and asking endless questions about the horses and cattle. And baby Carlos had become a chubby, happy infant who smiled at everyone and had started pulling himself up to stand, reaching always for the next adventure. But it was the changes in James that surprised Sarah most. The quiet sadness that had seemed to permeate the ranch house when she first arrived had gradually given way to something lighter. He laughed more, especially when the children were around, and Sarah had caught him more than once teaching how to rope or showing Maria the proper way to approach a horse. "He's different now," observed Sarah's sister, who had finally tracked them down after weeks of searching. She had driven out from San after Sarah managed to contact her through the Red Cross. "Happier." Sarah watched through the kitchen window as James helped repair a fence post while Maria sat on a nearby gate, singing to herself. "He lost his daughter," Sarah explained. "I think having children around again reminds him of good things." Studied her sister's face carefully. "And what about you? Are you happy here?" It was a complicated question. Sarah had found something on the ranch that she hadn't expected to find again: security, purpose, and a sense of belonging. But underneath it all was the constant awareness that this wasn't really her life. It was a gift, temporary and fragile, that could be taken away at any moment. "I'm grateful," Sarah said finally. "That's not the same thing as happy." Before Sarah could respond, James appeared in the kitchen doorway, Carlos balanced easily on his hip. The baby had taken to him immediately, perhaps sensing the same gentle strength that had drawn all of them to trust this man who had appeared in their darkest moment. "Sarah, there's someone here to see you," James said, but something in his tone made her stomach clench with familiar fear. In the living room, a woman in a business suit waited with a briefcase and the kind of official bearing that Sarah had learned to dread. Immigration officials, social workers, police, they all carried themselves the same way. "Mrs. Martinez, I'm Jennifer from Child Protective Services." The world tilted sideways. Sarah gripped the back of a chair to steady herself, every protective instinct screaming at her to gather her children and run. But there was nowhere to run anymore, and besides, she could see playing in the yard with Maria, both of them healthy and happy in a way they hadn't been for so long. "Someone reported concerns about the children's welfare," Ms. continued, consulting her clipboard. "Anonymous tip said there were undocumented children living in unsuitable conditions with no proper supervision." "That's not true," Sarah said quickly. "My children are well cared for. They're healthy. They're in school." "I can see that," Ms. interrupted, and Sarah caught something in her tone that wasn't entirely unfriendly. "That's why I'm here to see for myself what the situation actually is." James stepped forward slightly, a protective gesture that wasn't lost on either woman. "Mrs. Martinez is employed here," he said calmly. "She and her children live in the guest house on my property. Everything is completely legal and above board." Ms. looked between them with the sharp eyes of someone who had seen every kind of situation imaginable. "May I speak with the children?" The next hour was torture. Sarah watched through windows as the social worker talked with each of her children, taking notes, asking questions about their living conditions, their schooling, their health. Answered with the careful precision of a boy who understood that the wrong word could destroy everything. Was more natural, chattering about her favorite horse and how James had taught her to gather eggs from the chickens. When Ms. finally returned to the house, Sarah was standing exactly where she had left her, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. "Mrs. Martinez," the social worker began, "I want to be clear about something. The children are obviously healthy, well cared for, and happy. Whatever situation they were in before, this is clearly a significant improvement." Sarah felt some of the tension leave her shoulders, but she remained wary. "However," Ms. continued, "there are some legal issues we need to address. Immigration status, proper documentation, official guardianship arrangements. I'm going to need to file a report, but I want to work with you to ensure that whatever we do serves the children's best interests." "What does that mean?" Sarah asked. "It means I'm giving you 6 weeks to get your legal situation sorted out. Mr. mentioned you have an immigration attorney." James nodded. "David, he's been working on the family's case since they arrived here." "Good, Mr. is excellent. I'll coordinate with his office to make sure we're all working toward the same goal, keeping this family together." Ms. closed her briefcase and stood. "Mrs. Martinez, your children are lucky to have a mother who would do anything to protect them. And they're lucky to have found someone like Mr. who understands that sometimes families need help to get back on their feet." After the social worker left, Sarah collapsed into a chair, shaking with residual fear and relief. "It's going to be okay," James said quietly, sitting across from her. "David's been making progress, and now that CPS is involved in a supportive capacity, it actually might help our case." "Our case?" Sarah looked at him sharply. James had the grace to look embarrassed. "I meant your case, of course." But Sarah had heard what he said, and for the first time she allowed herself to wonder if maybe, just maybe, this place that felt like home might actually become one. Not because she was grateful or desperate, but because somewhere along the way, in the daily routine of cooking and cleaning and raising children and sharing stories, they had become something more than employer and employee. They had become family. That night, as she tucked the children into bed, Maria asked the question that had been haunting Sarah's thoughts all day. "Mama, are they going to make us leave?" Sarah looked at her daughter's trusting face and made a decision that would have terrified the desperate woman who had walked up that driveway 3 months ago. "No," she said firmly. "We're not going anywhere. This is our home now." 1 year later, Sarah stood in the same kitchen where she had first whispered her family's desperate hunger to a stranger. But now, instead of the sterile cleanliness of a house without children, the space buzzed with life. Carlos's high chair sat at the table, decorated with the cheerful mess of a toddler discovering the joy of self-feeding. Maria's drawings covered the refrigerator door, and school projects claimed space on the counter next to soccer trophies. The immigration hearing had been concluded 6 months earlier with an outcome that still felt like a miracle. David had worked tirelessly to navigate the complex legal system, and with James's unwavering support, both financial and emotional, they had achieved what Sarah had never dared to hope for: legal residency for her and all the children, with a clear path to citizenship. Even more remarkable was coming home. The same legal process that had secured their status had also paved the way for his release and return. Sarah had spoken with him by phone just that morning, confirming his flight details for the following week. After 18 months of separation, their family would finally be whole again. "You're nervous," James observed, appearing in the doorway with Carlos balanced on his shoulders. The toddler had taken to following James around the ranch like a devoted puppy, and James seemed to enjoy the constant companionship as much as Carlos did. "Terrified," Sarah admitted, putting down the dish towel she had been unconsciously wringing. "What if doesn't understand? What if he feels like I've replaced him somehow? What if he wants to leave here and go back to the city?" James lifted Carlos down and settled him in his high chair with a sippy cup of juice. "Have you talked to him about staying here?" "A little, but talking on the phone isn't the same as being here, seeing how we live now." Sarah gestured toward the window, where was teaching how to properly saddle a horse while Maria cheered them on from her perch on the fence. "This place, it's changed us all. The children have roots here now, real roots." "And you?" James asked quietly. Sarah met his gaze directly. "This is my home," she said simply. "Not because I have nowhere else to go anymore, but because I can't imagine being anywhere else." The conversation was interrupted by the rumble of an approaching vehicle. Through the window, Sarah could see a familiar pickup truck heading up the driveway. David, their attorney, arriving for what he had promised would be their final official meeting. But as the truck drew closer, Sarah realized there were two people in the cab. Her heart stopped as she recognized the passenger, a man whose face she had memorized from photographs but hadn't seen in person for too long. She breathed. James understood immediately. "David was supposed to pick him up from the airport next week," he said, checking his phone. "But I have 3 missed calls from David's office." Sarah was already running toward the door, her feet barely touching the ground as she flew down the porch steps. Behind her, she could hear James calling to the children, his voice carrying the news that would change everything once again. Climbed slowly out of the truck, and Sarah's steps faltered as she took in the changes that 18 months of detention had wrought. He was thinner, older somehow, with new lines around his eyes that spoke of worry and loss. But when he saw her, when their eyes met across the yard, his face transformed with a smile that erased the months of separation in an instant. They met halfway across the yard in an embrace that felt like coming home and starting over all at once. Sarah buried her face in his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent that meant safety and love, and the father her children had been missing. "Me," whispered against her hair, "I'm sorry I was gone so long." "You're here now," Sarah replied, her voice muffled against his chest. "That's all that matters." The reunion with the children was everything Sarah had dreamed of and more. Trying to maintain the dignity of his 12 years, ended up clinging to his father and crying happy tears. Launched herself into his arms with total abandon, chattering about horses and school and all the things she had saved up to tell him. Maria, shy at first with this man she barely remembered, was soon showing him her favorite hiding spots around the ranch. But it was Carlos who provided the most poignant moment. The toddler, who had never really known his father, studied with serious dark eyes before suddenly reaching out his arms with a smile that could have powered the entire ranch. As the family clustered together on the porch, James hung back, and Sarah suddenly realized how this must look to him. The family reunited and complete, perhaps no longer needing the sanctuary he had provided. She said, taking her husband's hand and drawing him toward James. "This is James. He saved our lives." The two men studied each other for a long moment. Was shorter than James, more compact, with the calloused hands of someone who worked construction. But there was a dignity in the way he carried himself, an intelligence in his dark eyes that missed nothing. "Mister," said carefully, his English heavily accented but clear. "My wife, she tells me you gave my family a home when they had nothing. There are no words for such a gift." "Your wife earned everything she received," James replied firmly. "She works harder than anyone I've ever employed, and your children have brought more life to this place than it's seen in years. If anyone should be grateful, it's me." David approached with a briefcase full of final paperwork and explanations about his legal status, but Sarah found it hard to concentrate on the details. Her mind was spinning with questions about the future, about what would happen next, about whether the sanctuary they had found could somehow accommodate this new reality. That evening, after the children were finally settled, and David had departed with promises to check in soon, the three adults sat on the porch as the sun set over the ranch. Held Carlos in his lap while the toddler fought sleep, determined not to miss a moment of his newly returned father's presence. "Sarah tells me you have made a place for my family here," said to James. "But now that I am back—" "Now that you're back, that place is still here," James interrupted gently. "Sarah manages this house better than I ever could, and the children have become part of the fabric of this place. If you're willing to stay, there's more than enough work on the ranch for another pair of skilled hands." Was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the land that his family had come to call home. "In detention," he said finally, "I imagined many futures, but I never imagined this. A place where my children could grow up with space to run, good schools, safety." He shifted Carlos to his other arm. "You would trust a man you barely know with your ranch." "I trust the man who raised children like yours," James replied simply. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the same spot where she had first whispered her family's desperation to a stranger. But now she was watching teach how to repair a section of fence, while James supervised with the patient smile of a grandfather. Carlos toddled between them all, chattering in the mixture of English and Spanish that had become the soundtrack of the ranch. And Maria were racing their horses in the nearby paddock, their laughter carried on the warm Texas breeze. The guest house had been expanded into a proper family home, and had proven himself as capable a ranch hand as James had hoped. More importantly, the two men had developed a partnership built on mutual respect and shared love for the land and the family it supported. There were still challenges, of course. Adjusting to life as a complete family again hadn't always been smooth, and sometimes struggled with the knowledge that his children had grown and changed during his absence. But love had a way of bridging gaps, and time had a way of healing wounds that once seemed permanent. As Sarah called everyone in for dinner, she thought about the woman who had walked up this driveway with nothing but desperate hope and 4 hungry children. That woman could never have imagined this life, this sense of belonging, this feeling that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The loaf of bread James had quietly handed her that first day had been about more than food. It had been about dignity, about seeing the humanity in strangers, about the kind of generosity that creates families where none existed before. Now, as she served a meal prepared in a kitchen that belonged to all of them, surrounded by the voices of children who were no longer hungry in any sense of the word, Sarah understood that some gifts transform not just the receiver, but the giver as well. They had all been hungry once for food, for family, for purpose, for healing. And somehow, in the simple act of sharing what they had with those who had nothing, they had all found exactly what they needed. The ranch that had once echoed with the hollow sound of loss now rang with the music of a family that had been born from kindness and nurtured by love. And Sarah knew, with the certainty that comes from having traveled through the valley of desperation to reach the mountaintop of belonging, that this was just the beginning of their story together.